Well, new criticism can seem very satisfactory, especially if one does what I couldn't do in the last video and really give a detailed overview of all the ways in which the common and uncommon, or the noisy and the poetic, recur throughout the poem, right, and really come together in that um, closing image of the poet waking up, right. Uh, But if, and now I'm going to start reading, but if I begin to start thinking like an ideal reader response critic, I might notice that my reading of the poem seems to leave out a big part of what makes the poem mean anything at all, namely me, my experience as the reader of the poem. If I weren't trained to notice paradoxes or to think of poor people as somehow common, rather classist of me, or to see a rigid division between noise and song, then my reading here would never have been accomplished. Instead of picking up on one tension and trying to make everything else in the poem fit that tension, perhaps it would make more sense to study the ways in which I find myself responding to the poem, the way in which it feels as if there is an ideal or implied reader structurally integrated into the poem itself, right, into the text. In what ways might the poem anticipate me? And if not me, then someone capable of responding to and understanding it. Okay. These are the sorts of questions a reader response critic might ask. Since there are many ways to approach criticism in the mode of reader response, our book mentions 3 different theoretical approaches to reading and responding in its 2nd chapter alone. I will simply make some observations concerning the difference between my own response to the poem as the real reader, and responses that the poem, seems to anticipate, those of an ideal reader or implied reader. First, what do I notice about the title? Okay. I'm trying to imagine I've never read the poem before, right? Well, looking just at the title, without having read the poem, I might notice that, it alludes to summer mornings, and summer mornings, in my experience, for the most part, carry a kind of pleasant connotation. When I initially go into this poem, I might expect, or I do expect, some sort of affirmative expression of urban life, vibrant, warm, healthy, diverse. This intuition is quickly dissipated, however, broken. This intuition fails, right, in the face of the sights and sounds with which the poem confronts me. Indeed, I'm disappointed by the opening question itself. Though I sense that the question, who has not waked to list the sounds of London, though I sense that it is meant to operate as a rhetorical question. I mean, come on, who hasn't waked to list the sounds of a city before, right? Nevertheless, I feel as if I come upon a stumbling block. The first lines make me face the fact that I have not had the common experience presumed of the one who is doing the reading here, the ideal one who is doing the reading. And so I sense a gap between the real reader, me, and the role structured into the poem itself, that is the ideal reader. I sense a concrete and contingent situation shared by comparatively few people in the history of the world. History, I should say, of human worlds, right? And I get a bit anxious that I might fail to truly succeed at inhabiting the role of the reader, especially since I'm not a late 18th century Londoner. As I move through the poem, I sense that this second intuition, that my first intuition will fail, comes true. Though I know what a chimney sweep is, right? I've seen Mary Poppins after all. I find myself confronted by several occupations that befuddle me. What is a dustman, a tin man, a cooper, a cork cutter, a fruit barrow, a neat girl, a pot boy, an old clothes man? I feel drawn to stop reading the poem and look up and study these words that would be transparent, at least I think they would be transparent, completely unremarkable to a late 18th century reader for whom they are part of a cultural idiom. And yet, though I cannot move through the poem with the simple knowledge of the poem's ideal reader, I nevertheless feel drawn through its lines because of its sounds, its surprising midline rhymes. Excuse me, I just spit all over my microphone. Its surprising midline rhymes, its heavily punctuated lists that perform the listing anticipated in the first line. As I read the poem out loud, right? One of the best ways in which to approach poetry. I feel put at ease that the poem means to move me quickly through its list of occupations, that the content of these occupations might not matter as much as the effect of their rapid accumulation. Though I might not be able to define all of these occupations without a dictionary, or even imagine what it was like to live these occupations in the late 18th century, I still notice the repetition of the word now, which begins nearly every sentence of the poem, right? So if we turn to page 4, if you look at line 9, now begins the din of hackney coaches. If you look at line 20, now the sun darts burning splendor on the glittering pane. Line 15, now every shop displays its trade. Line 23, now spruce and trim in shops where beauty smiles with industry. Line 27, now pastry dainties. Line 29, now the lamplighter. Line 35, now the bag is slyly opened. This pattern of nowness is not immediately noticeable since only one of these sentences begin a line, right? So in other words, sentences tend to begin in the middle of lines in this poem, right? So it's harder to notice that pattern. And yet one does notice it, I think, near the end of the poem when the frequency of the word now increases. We get shorter sentences at the end of the poem than we do at the beginning. And when I reread the poem, it is difficult to see it as anything other than an attempt to present, to make present, to make now, right now, something remarkable, something notable, as if someone is drawing my readerly eye again and again to the same activity, though each time it draws my eye, it shows me something different. The final image of the poem, the poet who wakes to paint the sounds she hears, suggests that what matters is not so much the making uncommon of the common, but the simultaneity, the simultaneousness of various nows, now this, now that, now that, now that, all together at the same time. That the simultaneity of these various nows that will be made to exist side by side in a verbal landscape. Just as trees and rocks and hills and people and animals and skies and stars coexist in landscape paintings, so suffering, working, shrilling, cleaning, lighting, living, various activities and various roles and various occupations and various forms of life are made to coexist in the poem. Whether or not I know how such people lived, may in this sense be irrelevant. Why? Because by rendering the sounds of the city into simultaneous sights, the poem presumably makes visible that which might not have been visible to many of the same inhabitants of the city. Why would the poet wake to paint the city in this way, if it were not to anticipate a reader seeing something like it for the first time? Here I sense the gap between an 18th century ideal reader and a 21st century real reader begin to close. As I continue to read and respond to the poem in this way, I am made to think of a rather important gap in the poem's content. Maybe the ideal reader, sensing the poem's content for the first time, are the ones who are missing from the poem, the ones who do the buying, or who have people who do the buying for them, those who are still sleeping, not hearing the din of the streets, who have no shops to open, who have the chimneys in need of sweeping, who usually give no second thought to the age of the boy who will be sent up into a chimney, to clean it, who will give no second thought to the emotional or intellectual life of the maid who keeps house, who will not have to do his or her own sweeping. If this is the case, then the ideal reader is the one who will be taught by the poem to see in a swift and potentially surprising way the side of a city that has never been hidden, but that has been right in front of them this whole time without having been experienced. Though I have a good excuse not to have noticed this landscape of labor before, since I'm not an late 18th century Londoner, the poem nevertheless provokes me to respond. What nows elude me? What sound and landscapes have I been missing that are right in front of my face. So that's sort of the beginning of a reader response approach to this poem. If I were writing an essay, I would want to fill it in with a bit more engagement with the text itself. So anyway, in my next video, this one was a little short. I hope I wasn't reading too fast. I feel sort of excited having read it. In my next video, I want to think about how a post-structuralist, specifically a deconstructivist, might approach this poem and how it would differ from the first two approaches. And I also want to consider quickly in the next video how a new historicist might take the lessons learned by all three approaches and bring those lessons to other non-literary texts. And then I also want to summarize the insights or summarize the differences between those four readings. Okay. All right.